Hey, Holy Girls, welcome back to Holy Girl Talk. If you're a returning listener, thank you so much for coming back and spending this time with me again. Truly. And if this is your very first episode, welcome. I'm really glad you're here. Holy Girl Talk is a space where we talk about God, scripture, womanhood, healing, dating, boundaries, and real life in a way that's honest, wise, and grounded. You don't need to be perfect to be here. You don't need to have everything figured out. You're welcome exactly as you are. And before we get into today's conversation, let me say this. If you know a woman who is dating, healing from past relationships, questioning her patterns, or trying to figure out what healthy love is supposed to look like, please share this episode with her. Send it to the friend who keeps asking, is this normal? Or the one who's tired of confusion and wants clarity. This episode is meant to be a gentle mirror and a wise guide. Okay, let's get into it. Today we're talking about dating like Ruth, not Delilah. And I want to be really clear from the beginning. This is not about shaming anyone. It's not about labeling women as good or bad. It's about learning from scripture and becoming more self-aware because the Bible doesn't just tell stories to entertain us, it tells stories to teach us. And if you've never heard the stories of Ruth or Delilah before, that's completely okay. You don't need to know anything going in. I'll walk you through both. Ruth and Delilah are two women in scripture who both desired connection, love, and relationship, but they move very differently. Ruth's story is one of loyalty, humility, patience, and character. Her love story unfolds slowly and safely, rooted in integrity and trust in God. Delilah's story, on the other hand, is a cautionary one. It shows what happens when connection is used for control, when intimacy becomes transactional, and when emotional wounds drive unhealthy choices. Both women teach us something. Ruth shows us what aligned, God-centered dating can look like. Delilah shows us what happens when insecurity, manipulation, or pressure take the lead. And the goal of this episode is not to judge either woman, it's to ask ourselves honest questions about our own dating posture. Because dating isn't just about who you choose, it's about how you show up. It's about your motivations, your boundaries, your healing, and your values. And the truth is, many modern dating struggles are not new problems. They're old patterns playing out in new ways. So this episode is for the holy girls who want wisdom, the ones who want love but don't want confusion, the ones who are healing, waiting, dating, or reevaluating what they've accepted in the past. Ruth and Delilah give us two very different blueprints, and both invite us to become more intentional women. Let's talk about that. So let's slow down and really talk about why Ruth and Delilah matter when it comes to dating, especially if these stories feel ancient or far removed from modern life. Because on the surface, they might seem like two random women from the Bible. But when you look closer, they represent two very different ways of approaching love, connection, and influence. Ruth's story takes place during a time of loss and uncertainty. She's a widow, she's a foreigner. She has no security, no status, and no guarantee that life is going to work out in her favor. And yet, the way Ruth moves is intentional. She chooses loyalty over convenience. She chooses character over survival instincts. She commits to Naomi, aligns herself with God's people, and quietly builds a life rooted in faithfulness, long before romance ever enters the picture. Delilah's story is very different. She appears in the life of Samson, a man with great strength but deep vulnerability. Delilah's role in scripture centers around influence and access. She's close to Samson, she has intimacy with him, but instead of using that closeness to protect him, she uses it to pressure him, manipulate him, and ultimately betray him for personal gain. Her story is not about romance, it's about control, leverage, and misaligned motivation. And here's why this comparison matters. Both women wanted connection. Both had access to men. Both had influence. The difference wasn't desire, it was posture. Ruth moved from wholeness and trust in God. Delilah moved from insecurity and self-interest. One allowed God to shape her love story. The other tried to control outcomes through emotional pressure. This is where dating becomes less about rules and more about self-awareness. Because the Bible isn't telling us, be Ruth, don't be Delilah in a shallow way. It's asking deeper questions. Why do you want this relationship? What are you hoping it will fix? Are you trusting God with the outcome or are you trying to force one? Ruth and Delilah show us that dating reveals what's happening internally. Our choices in relationships often mirror our healing, our wounds, and our beliefs about ourselves. And that's why these stories are still relevant. Different era, same human heart. Let's talk about Ruth for a moment, because her story is often romanticized, but what's actually powerful about her has very little to do with Boaz at first. Ruth's posture was set long before a love story ever began. She was loyal, she was consistent, she was grounded, and she chose faithfulness when it would have been easier to choose self-preservation. Ruth wasn't chasing attention. She wasn't positioning herself to be noticed. She was working, she was providing, she was honoring Naomi, she was showing up every day with integrity, even when life felt uncertain. And that's important because Ruth teaches us that godly relationships don't start with chemistry, they start with character. Her confidence didn't come from being desired, it came from knowing who she was and where she belonged. Ruth aligned herself with God's people, God's ways, and God's timing. She didn't rush the process. She didn't manipulate outcomes. She trusted that obedience mattered more than urgency. And this is so relevant for modern dating because it's easy to feel like you have to perform to be chosen, to present a certain version of yourself, to bend your values to keep someone interested. But Ruth shows us another way. She lived a full, faithful life without centering her identity around being pursued. And love found her in that place of alignment. Dating like Ruth means focusing on becoming whole instead of becoming impressive. It means building a life you're proud of, regardless of who's watching. It means trusting that the right relationship will recognize your character without you having to convince anyone of your worth. Ruth's story reminds us that healthy love is drawn to women who are walking in purpose, not chasing validation. Now let's talk about Delilah, and I want to approach this gently and honestly because her story is often oversimplified. Delilah is not presented in scripture as a cartoon villain. She's a woman with access, influence, and proximity to a man who is emotionally vulnerable. And the danger in her story isn't her femininity or her desire for connection, it's how she uses it. Delilah's relationship with Samson is built on pressure, not trust, on leverage, not safety. She repeatedly asks him to reveal the source of his strength, not out of care, but out of persistence and manipulation. She pushes, she wears him down emotionally. She makes him feel guilty for withholding information. And eventually, Samson gives in, not because it's wise, but because he's exhausted. This is where the story becomes painfully modern, because manipulation doesn't always look dramatic or malicious. Sometimes it looks like emotional pressure, like repeatedly asking for reassurance, like making someone feel bad for having boundaries, like confusing intimacy with entitlement. Delilah's story warns us about relationships where access is demanded instead of earned. And here's the hard but freeing truth. Delilah didn't destroy Samson's strength. His lack of discernment did. But Delilah did reveal what happens when connection is used for control instead of care. Her story invites us to examine our own motivations. Are we seeking closeness to build something healthy or to get something we feel we're missing? This isn't about labeling women as manipulative, it's about recognizing patterns. Because when insecurity leads the way, relationships become transactional, affection becomes leverage, intimacy becomes a tool instead of a gift, and that always leads to harm. Dating like Delilah means trying to force outcomes instead of trusting God with timing. Dating like Ruth means allowing character and alignment to speak for themselves. And the difference between the two often comes down to healing. One of the biggest differences between Ruth and Delilah isn't who they were attracted to, it's why they pursued connection in the first place. And this is where dating gets real, because attraction is easy. Chemistry happens naturally, but motivation reveals maturity. Ruth didn't pursue a relationship to fill a void. She wasn't looking for Boaz to rescue her identity, fix her pain, or give her worth. She was already living faithfully, already grounded, already aligned. When love entered her life, it added, it didn't compensate. Her motivation was stability, integrity, and trust in God. Delilah's motivation was different. Her connection to Samson was tied to gain, to control, to outcome. And when relationships are driven by unmet needs, unhealed wounds, or fear of being alone, they become unsafe. Not because the desire for love is wrong, but because pressure replaces patience. This is where a lot of modern dating confusion lives. We confuse intensity with intention. We confuse attention with care. We mistake someone wanting us for someone being good for us. But motivation exposes everything. Are you dating because you're lonely or because you're ready? Are you pursuing because you're aligned or because you're anxious? Dating like Ruth means asking yourself honest questions. Am I trying to force closeness or am I allowing connection to grow naturally? Am I being myself or am I adjusting my values to be chosen? Am I trusting God with timing or am I trying to control outcomes? Because attraction fades, chemistry fluctuates, but motivation shapes the health of the relationship long term. And when your motivation is wholeness instead of desperation, your dating choices become clearer, calmer, and wiser. Now let's talk about Boaz, because his response to Ruth tells us so much about what healthy, God honoring pursuit actually looks like. Boaz doesn't notice Ruth because she's flashy or performative. He notices her character. He hears about her loyalty. He sees her work ethic. He observes how she treats Naomi, how she carries herself, how she shows up consistently without drawing attention to herself. And what does he do with that information? He protects her. He respects her. He creates safety. He speaks kindly to her. He makes sure she's provided for. He doesn't rush her. He doesn't confuse her. He doesn't pressure her. He doesn't make her guess where she stands. This is important because healthy pursuit is clear, it's steady, it's intentional. Boaz doesn't play games. He doesn't blur lines. He doesn't use charm to bypass boundaries. He honors Ruth publicly and privately. He covers her reputation. He moves with integrity even when no one would have blamed him for doing less. And that's such a contrast to what many women experience today. Situationships, mixed signals, emotional availability with no commitment, intimacy without clarity. Boaz shows us that when a man is aligned, you don't have to decode his intentions. They're visible in his actions. What's also beautiful here is that Ruth doesn't have to audition for Boaz's affection. She doesn't have to convince him of her worth. She doesn't have to manipulate the outcome. Her life speaks for her, and Boaz responds to that. This section is not about idolizing marriage or putting men on pedestals. It's about wisdom. It's about knowing what healthy pursuit looks like so you don't normalize confusion or settle for less than respect. A man who is right for you will not require you to abandon your values, chase clarity, or compromise your peace. Boaz's response reminds us that godly love is not chaotic, it's calm, it's covering, it's consistent, and it honors the woman it pursues. Now let's talk about what's usually happening underneath dating, the part we don't always say out loud. The insecurities, the expectations, the fear of rejection, the desire to be chosen, the temptation to settle, because dating is rarely just about the other person. It's about what gets activated inside of us. Ruth and Delilah both wanted connection, but what they did with their emotions was very different. Ruth didn't let fear rush her. She didn't let uncertainty push her into compromise. She trusted God even when her future wasn't guaranteed. She allowed space for clarity. She moved with patience instead of panic. Delilah, on the other hand, allowed pressure to lead. Her story shows what happens when emotional wounds go unexamined, when fear of loss turns into control, when desire for closeness turns into entitlement. And that's such a warning for modern dating because unhealed emotions don't disappear just because you're in a relationship. They usually get louder. This is where many women struggle quietly. The fear of being alone makes red flags easier to ignore. The pressure of timelines makes patience feel unbearable. Comparison makes you question your worth. And instead of listening to wisdom, you start negotiating your standards just to keep connection. Ruth teaches us that you don't have to rush love to secure it. You don't have to manipulate outcomes to feel safe, and you don't have to abandon yourself to be chosen. Emotional maturity in dating looks like awareness. It looks like knowing when fear is talking instead of faith. It looks like pausing instead of pushing. Because when emotions are leading without healing, dating becomes exhausting. But when emotions are acknowledged and guided by wisdom, dating becomes clearer, calmer, and healthier. Dating today looks very different than it did in Ruth or Delilah's time, but the heart issues are the same. We just have more noise now. Social media, dating apps, situationships, surface level attraction, being mistaken for compatibility. Everyone is accessible, but very few people are intentional. Modern dating often rewards chemistry over character. It celebrates intensity instead of consistency. It normalizes confusion and calls it going with the flow. And if you're not careful, you can slowly start lowering your standards just to keep up with the culture. Ruth's story reminds us that wisdom doesn't go out of style. Alignment still matters, integrity still matters, spiritual clarity still matters. The right relationship will not require you to abandon your values, rush intimacy, or silence your discernment just to feel chosen. Dating like Ruth in a modern world means you don't let trends define your boundaries. You don't confuse availability with access. You don't treat red flags as personality traits. You don't settle for attention when what you actually want is intention. And this doesn't mean dating becomes rigid or joyless. It means it becomes peaceful, clear, grounded. You move slower because you're not anxious. You ask better questions because you're not desperate. You walk away sooner because you trust God more than potential. Loving with wisdom is not old fashioned, it's faith in action. And in a culture that thrives on confusion, clarity is powerful. This is where I want to slow the conversation down a little, because becoming a Ruth is not about aesthetics, personality traits, or trying to fit a certain mold. Ruth is not a brand. She's not a dating strategy. She's a posture. Becoming a Ruth doesn't mean being passive, silent, or overly accommodating. It doesn't mean shrinking yourself or waiting around for someone to notice you. And it definitely doesn't mean being perfect. Ruth was human, she was vulnerable, she had uncertainty, but she moved with integrity even when things were unclear. Sometimes women try to perform righteousness instead of cultivating maturity. They try to look patient without actually healing impatience. They try to look confident without doing the inner work. They try to act chill while suppressing their needs. But Ruth didn't perform, she lived aligned. Being a Ruth means you protect your heart without hardening it. You know your worth without arrogance. You show up fully without losing yourself. You don't manipulate outcomes, but you also don't abandon discernment. You're honest, you're grounded, you're emotionally responsible. And this is key. Ruth didn't become who she was to get Boaz. She became who she was because she chose faithfulness in her everyday life. Love didn't define her character defined the kind of love she could sustain. This section is for women who are tired of trying to do dating right and just want peace. Becoming a Ruth is not about impressing God or men. It's about becoming emotionally healthy, spiritually rooted, and self-aware enough to love well, whether you're single, dating, or waiting. If you're listening to this and you're navigating dating right now, I want you to know you're not doing it wrong just because it feels confusing sometimes. Dating can bring up a lot: old wounds, new hopes, insecurities you thought were healed. And that doesn't mean you're failing, it means you're human. Take a moment to reflect honestly. In your dating life, where have you been moving like Ruth? Grounded, intentional, aligned? And where have you felt tempted to move like Delilah? Rushing connection, forcing clarity, or using emotional pressure to feel secure? These questions aren't meant to shame you. They're meant to bring awareness, because awareness is what creates change. Ruth reminds us that love rooted in wisdom is patient, that character speaks louder than performance, and that the right relationship will not require you to compromise your values, manipulate outcomes, or silence your discernment. Delilah reminds us what happens when wounds lead instead of healing. And if this episode resonated with you, please share it. Send it to the friend who's dating with a soft heart and needs wisdom, the woman who's healing from unhealthy patterns, the one who keeps asking God what love is supposed to look like. One share could save someone a lot of confusion and heartache. Thank you, Holy Girls, for spending this time with me today. Thank you for listening with openness and honesty. If you'd like to send in prayer requests, testimonies, or episode suggestions, you can email holygirltalkpodcast@gmail.com. And if you haven't already, make sure you're following Holy Girl Talk so you don't miss future episodes like this one. I'm praying that you date with clarity, courage, and peace, that you trust God with timing, that you honor your heart without hardening it, and that you remember loving with wisdom is one of the most powerful acts of faith there is. Until next time, Holy Girls, keep choosing alignment.